I am Brooklyn Hayes. I am 68 years old, a retired nurse from Savannah, Georgia. I spent my life caring for strangers with patience and skill, and I believed that when my time of need came, my family would care for me. After my husband passed away, I sold our little house thinking it was practical to move in with my son Reed and his wife Hayla. They told me it would ease my loneliness and give me security. In those first weeks, I let myself believe them, thinking I had found a safe place to rest after years of long shifts and quiet nights at the hospital. At the beginning, they were kind. Reed carried in my boxes telling me to relax. Hella smiled and said having me there would make the house warmer. I unpacked, slowly setting a few keepsakes on the dresser in the guest room, folding my late husband's cardigan with care. I hung it on a wooden hook by the door. It carried the scent of antiseptic and faint soap, a reminder of our shared years in medicine and in marriage. That cardigan made me feel like he was still standing by me, but warmth faded quickly. Within a month, Hella brought papers to the kitchen table. She explained them in a tone I knew well from nurses giving orders to patients. The sheets listed utilities, groceries, and household expenses. At the bottom was my share, a number that nearly swallowed my entire pension. Reed sat beside her, nodding silently. I looked at him for comfort, but he did not meet my eyes. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it was family helping family. The weeks stretched, and the air inside that house began to change. I rose early to make coffee the way I once did for my husband, but now it was consumed without thanks. I cleaned the counters, kept the children entertained, and paid what was asked of me. Still, I felt like a tenant in a space that was never mine. The cardigan stayed on the hook, though one afternoon Hella glanced at it and said coldly that the hook was for guests, not storage. My breath caught in my chest, but I said nothing. Loneliness crept into me even when people were near. At dinner, I listened more than I spoke, nodding, while Hella described her shopping trips and Reed mumbled about work. The silence between us was louder than the words. Nights in the guest room felt heavier than any shift I'd ever worked. I thought about the house I'd left behind, the garden we once tended, and the porch where I drank sweet tea with my husband as the sun fell over the marsh. Every corner of their home reminded me that I no longer belonged. The kitchen smelled of spices I did not recognize. The living room walls displayed photos that did not include me. Even the children called me Grandma politely, but with hesitation, as if waiting for permission from their mother. I tried to tell myself that love shows in actions, not words, but each action showed me my place was shrinking. The betrayal grew heavier because it was quiet. There were no harsh fights or loud rejections. It was in the way Reed avoided conversations about money. It was in the way Hella handed me bills without discussion. It was in the way my pension vanished each month while my dignity slipped away. I had cared for hundreds of patients who were strangers, yet here I was, treated as a burden in the home of my own blood. Sometimes at night, I sat in the dark and listened to the house. I could hear laughter from the master bedroom, clinking glasses, when friends visited, the steady hum of a dishwasher I had loaded. I told myself to be grateful for shelter, but gratitude is hollow when it is demanded instead of given. The cardigan on the hook became the only thing that made me feel anchored. Each time I touched it, I remembered my husband's steady voice telling me I was stronger than I knew. The story of how family can turn into strangers is not loud or sudden. It is slow, measured in expense sheets and side glances. It is the shift from being welcome to being tolerated. It is the sting of realizing that promises of support were only words meant to soften the burden of guilt. In that house, I learned what it feels like to be disposable. I learned how betrayal can live in silence. And I began to understand that survival sometimes means noticing when love has turned into calculation. I used to tell myself that helping around the house was my way of showing gratitude. Cooking dinner, folding laundry, and watching the children gave me purpose. But the longer I stayed, the less it felt like kindness, and the more it felt like duty. Reed and Hella began to vanish into their own routines, leaving me to pick up the pieces of their home. I cooked every meal and scrubbed every pan. I drove the children to school, ironed their clothes, and stayed awake when they were sick. My pension went into their bills, and my hands went into their work. The line between guest and servant blurred so slowly that I almost missed it. Hela would hand me lists for groceries without asking if I had the time. Reed would leave his shoes in the hallway, knowing I would put them away. I told myself that family is supposed to share responsibilities, but this sharing had only one direction. I gave, they received. There were days I thought about speaking up, but every time I looked at Reed, I saw the boy I raised, the one who once brought me flowers from the yard and promised I would never be alone. His silence cut deeper than Hela's sharp words. It was easier to believe he was busy, distracted, weighed down by work. Yet the truth sat heavy in my chest. Silence is also a choice. The lowest point came one evening when Hela hosted a dinner party. She invited her friends' women with polished nails and voices that carried across the dining room. I spent the afternoon preparing appetizers, roasting chicken, and arranging the table. When the guests arrived, I was asked to pour wine and clear plates. I moved quietly, balancing a tray of glasses while they laughed about vacations and shopping trips. At one point, Hela leaned toward her friend and said with a grin that keeping me in the house was like having live-in help who paid for the privilege. The table erupted in laughter. My hands tightened around the tray until I thought the glass might break. I kept my face turned toward the shadows so no one would see the tears pressing against my eyes. I swallowed them down and kept walking. That moment branded itself in me. I had been reduced to a joke in the very home where I had hoped to find comfort. Standing there with the tray against my chest, I felt invisible. Not a mother, not a nurse, not a woman who had worked a lifetime to provide, just a servant paying rent for the right to serve. After the guests left, I cleared the table alone. My back ached, and my heart ached worse. I thought about my husband's cardigan, still hanging on the hook in the hallway. I could almost hear his voice reminding me of my worth. I clung to the memory because in that house, my worth had been stripped away piece by piece. That night, I lay awake, the sound of laughter still echoing in my ears. Humiliation pressed on me like a weight. I realized I had become a fixture in Reed and Hela's life, useful, but unwanted, tolerated, because I filled the gaps in their comfort. A servant, disguised as family. The pain of that truth carved itself into me, and though I did not yet know how, a part of me began to long for the moment when things would change. The morning I decided to visit the bank, the sky was low and gray, the kind of winter light that makes you feel the weight of the years behind you. I carried a small key in my purse, the one my husband had pressed into my hand long before he died. At the time, I thought it was a formality, a safe place for a few papers, nothing that would matter much. As I walked into the bank past the polished floors and quiet desks, I felt the memory of his hand in mine. He always planned carefully, and I was about to see just how carefully. The clerk led me to a private room and brought out the small metal box. My fingers trembled as I turned the key, lifting the lid slowly as if I might disturb his spirit. Inside were folders, neatly stacked bonds, tucked in envelopes and statements from accounts I had never paid much attention to. My husband had been methodical, setting aside portions of every paycheck, investing modestly but steadily. As I spread the papers across the table, the numbers began to add up. $4.9 million in total value. I stared at the figure until it blurred before my eyes. For years, I had lived as though my only lifeline was a modest pension. I had let Reed and Hela treat me as if I depended on their roof to survive. Yet here was the truth. I was more secure than they could ever imagine. The thought sent a shiver through me, not of fear, but of relief. I had been walking through their house as a shadow, when all along I carried the power to walk free. Mr. Turner, the family lawyer, stepped into the room a few minutes later. He was older now, with slower steps, but his voice still carried the calm assurance I remembered. He handed me a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges. He told me my husband had written it months before his passing, with instructions to share it only when I came to the bank. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper. His words were steady, just as he had been. He reminded me that he had built the safety net for a reason. He wrote that if love ever turned into leverage, I must not feel guilty for choosing my dignity. He told me this money was not a fortune to flaunt, but wings to carry me away from anyone who would use me. Reading his handwriting was like hearing his voice again. I pressed the letter to my chest, and for a moment I could almost believe he was beside me, urging me to stand tall. I closed the box, slid the papers back into place, and locked it again. When the clerk carried it away, I felt a sense of finality and also a surge of strength. Walking out of the bank, the cold air hit my face like a fresh beginning. I held my purse close, not because of its weight, but because of the secret it carried. Reed and Hella believed I was powerless. They believed my life rested on their generosity. For now, I would let them believe it. There was power in silence, and I intended to keep mine until the moment it mattered most. As I walked back to the car, I felt a quiet triumph settle inside me. I was no longer a guest trapped in someone else's house. I was a woman with choices, and one day soon, I would show them what that meant. Reed came home one night with a shine in his eyes I had not seen since he was a boy. Hella clung to his arm. Her smile stretched wide as she announced that their real estate project had secured investors. They claimed the numbers showed a return of $53 million. The house buzzed with champagne and phone calls as if wealth had already landed in their pockets. I sat quietly at the edge of the room, clutching a mug of tea, listening as they boasted to friends about their future. Within days, the shift was clear. Hella strutted through the house with catalogs of furniture and vacation brochures. Reed walked with a swagger, talking about new cars and properties. They spoke to me with a sharpness that had not been there before. One evening, Hella laid her manicured hand on my arm and said they no longer needed my pension money. She told me bluntly that it was time for me to find my own place. Reed tried to soften the blow, though his words cut just as deep. He said I would understand later, when their success was complete, that it was best for everyone. He called it practical, the same word he had used when he first asked me to leave my old home. I looked into his eyes, searching for the son I raised, but I saw only a man intoxicated by promises of wealth. The next morning, I packed my things in silence. My belongings fit into an old valise with scuffed corners, the same one I had carried decades ago when I left for nursing school. As I dragged it across the wooden floor, the wheels scraped with a sound that pierced the quiet. The house smelled of fresh paint and expensive candles, yet I felt like a stranger walking out of a hotel I had overpaid for. At the door, I paused. Behind me, Reed's voice echoed that I would understand later, as if betrayal would somehow feel softer with time. I tightened my grip on the handle and stepped into the cold air. Loneliness pressed down heavier than the bag I carried. My son had measured my worth against numbers on a page and decided I was no longer needed. That knowledge burned deeper than any wound I had ever treated at the hospital. It took only a few months for the dream to collapse. The investors pulled out, the market shifted, and the $53 million they had counted as theirs vanished into dust. Creditors circled like vultures, phone calls filled with threats, and the friends who once toasted their success stopped answering the door. Reed and Hella, who had once looked down at me with prideful eyes, now appeared on my porch, pale and desperate. Their clothes hung looser, their voices cracked with fatigue, and I saw the fear they tried to hide. They sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same one where Hella once spread her expense sheets. This time there were no polished nails or catalogs of luxury, only trembling hands and unpaid bills. Reed lowered his head and said they needed my help. He reminded me that I was family, that families stood together in hard times. Hella added that the children should not suffer because of mistakes made by adults. Their words echoed hollow, yet I could see the panic behind them. I let the silence stretch before I reached for the drawer beside me. From it, I pulled out a worn ledger, the one I had guarded for decades. I opened it slowly, turning the pages so they could see the neat columns of deposits and investments, the careful records my husband and I had kept year after year. The total at the bottom was not 53 million, but it was steady, real, and untouched by greed. Almost 5 million in savings, built not on promises but on discipline. I looked at Reed and Hella as their eyes widened. I told them that while they had been chasing millions, I had been protecting thousands. I told them that wealth is not measured by how high you reach in a frenzy, but by what you hold with patience and care. Their faces drained of color as the truth settled in. The woman they had dismissed as powerless had been stronger than they ever imagined. I closed the ledger and folded my hands. My voice was calm, steady, and final. I said I would decide how to use these savings, and that their arrogance no longer had power over me. In that moment, the balance shifted. The weight of humiliation I'd carried for months lifted, replaced by quiet strength. For the first time in years, I was in control. I agreed to help Reed, but only on my terms. I told him I would cover the most urgent debts so the children would not feel the weight of their parents' mistakes, but there were conditions. He would attend financial counseling. Hella would find steady work, and neither of them would ever touch the principle of my savings. The words felt firm in my mouth, not cruel, but unshakable. For the first time in years, I saw in Reed's eyes that he believed me. He sat with his shoulders slumped, his voice low, as he confessed what I had never expected to hear. He said he had always feared being weaker than his father, that every deal he chased was an attempt to prove he was not small. He admitted that the money had blinded him, and that pushing me aside had been easier than facing his own shame. For a moment, he looked like the boy who once held my hand at the county fair, scared of losing me in the crowd. Hela said little, her pride a shield she could not yet lower, but I noticed the way she avoided my eyes. Perhaps shame takes longer to surface in some people. I let silence fill the space, not demanding more. My conditions remained, and whether they liked them or not, they would stand. Boundaries are not made to be comfortable. They are made to protect what matters. Weeks later, I unlocked the door to my own apartment by the ocean. The air smelled of salt and carried the cry of gulls. I hung a single key on a wooden hook by the door the same way I once hung my husband's cardigan. On the table sat his photo, the corners worn soft from my hands. I looked at his smile and whispered that I had kept my promise to value myself. Peace settled over me like a tide, rolling and steady and unstoppable. It was not about numbers in a ledger or debts repaid. It was about freedom. I realized that peace is the ability to choose who belongs in your life and who no longer does. And for the first time in years, I felt truly at home.